Hello and welcome to Today's Take, hosted by me, Jane Azzopardi, the podcast that goes beyond the headlines to give you the story behind the story that you see on TV. And this week we are heading to Washington DC for that long-awaited meeting that put the AUKUS into AUKUS.
Ooh, that was the really uncomfortable moment, and we felt that being there in the cabinet room. It was a bit of a cringe moment when Donald Trump was asking who that ambassador was that had said anything bad about him, and Kevin Rudd was sitting directly opposite, right across the road from the president. A bit of an uncomfortable moment. There was a few laughs as this was all said, and I think the really important moment, though, came when those cameras stopped rolling. As we were moving out of the cabinet room, there was actually an apology from Kevin Rudd to Donald Trump. He said sorry for those comments he'd made in the past. He'd made a few tweets back in 2020. He'd since deleted them as he became the ambassador. But an apology there. And Donald Trump said that all is forgiven, said that he looked like a nice guy to Kevin Rudd. So I think things have been smoothed out behind the camera.
And the Prime Minister joins us now live from Washington DC to discuss. And who's a happy camper, PM?
Good morning. Well, it's a beautiful day here in Washington, D.C.
Were you there when he apologised to the President? What did he say and what was the aftermath of that?
Yeah, well, the President said it was as people were walking out, the journos, President Trump said, he said he looks like a good guy, or something like a nice guy. And I said, he is a nice guy, he's terrific. Something like that. And he said, all is forgiven. Kevin said, yeah, well, sorry. Like it was just... It was no
Sounds a bit flippant.
No, sounds like it's a family barbecue.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, inside the room where that meeting took place was our very own Washington correspondent, Lauren Tomasi, and she joins me here now. Lauren, welcome back to Today's Take.
Thanks, Jane. Great to be with you.
Now, we're going to get to all the important stuff and the issues around the relationship very soon. But first of all, I want to know, you were in that room. Was it as awkward in real life as it looked for us watching on TV?
You know those moments when you just physically cringe? It was one of those moments. I was like, oh my gosh, is this really happening? This has just played out before us, not only in this cabinet room with the US president, but to the cameras going around the world. I think everyone felt a little bit the same, as this unfolded. Because we were kind of halfway through this press conference that Donald Trump was, sitting side by side with Anthony Albanese, and then came this moment with Australia's ambassador to the US, Kevin Rudd, and I just couldn't believe what was unfolding. I mean, we know that Donald Trump often has the Trump tornado effect, and there are these moments, but to have it, with Australia front and centre, it was strange being in there.
Do you know what it reminded me of? I don't know if you've seen that meme of The Simpsons of Homer Simpson kind of backing into the hedge and he disappears. I felt like that must have been how Kevin Rudd would have felt in that moment.
I think that is such a perfect summary. And, when I rewatch the vision looking at Kevin Rudd's face, that is exactly how it was reflected. Because I was standing just behind Ambassador Rudd. And so I was looking directly at the US president, at Anthony Albanese and his cabinet members. I was just thinking, if that were me, I would definitely be shrinking back into the shrubs.
Now, we know, there was a lot of laughing in the room. We heard from Penny Wong the next day describing it as a tongue-in-cheek moment. Do you think Kevin Rudd found it funny?
Look, when I look at his expression, I don't think he found it funny in the moment. And I don't really think it was tongue-in-cheek by the US president either. In that moment, Donald Trump heard, someone said something bad about me. Who was it? Oh, it was you. And he pointed directly at Kevin Rudd as he said this and said, I don't like you. I probably never will. Now, we know that it was all smoothed over in the end, but in that moment, it was definitely... It was cringe, but the laughter in the room was also really funny. I think that, in part, people were a little taken aback because you had the, Vice President J.D. Vance who kind of threw his head back in laughter, the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth. But one of the things, I've thought about since this all unfolded was also sitting in that room, you had the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, America's top diplomat, who in the past himself has called Donald Trump a con man. So we know that Donald Trump doesn't hold a grudge because he's moved on with his own cabinet, and thankfully that seems to be the case with Kevin Rudd too.
Yeah, we have heard it's all been smoothed over. Were you still in the room when Kevin Rudd made his apology? Because we heard that sort of happened as the journalists were being ushered out.
Yeah, so it's really interesting how these things work with the US president. The second that he says thank you, that's it. The cameras have to stop rolling. And what they call the press wranglers who work inside the White House immediately start ushering the press out. So I was standing next to our political editor, Charlie Croucher, and we stepped out of the room. But who was right in the centre was our cameraman, Rich Moran. He was acting as the pool camera for the day. So that means that he was working on behalf of all of our Australian networks, and he was right in the centre opposite Donald Trump and Anthony Albanese, and he heard all of this unfold. He heard that apology from Kevin Rudd and Donald Trump saying, you know, all is forgiven. And as he stepped out with all of his gear, he came to us and said, I've just heard the apology.
Okay, all right. Well, that's interesting to know that this is sort of how those things work. Okay, we've talked about, I guess, the fun stuff that everyone's been talking about this week, but this meeting was very serious. It had been 10 months in the making. There was a whole lot at stake for Anthony Albanese. How important, set the stage for us, how important was this first official meeting between our Prime Minister and the US President?
I mean, gee, this was probably one of, if not the most important meetings of Anthony Albanese's political career. There had been so much pressure to set this up, and you know, while the pair had a few phone calls, they couldn't secure the face-to-face meeting at the G7. There was only that brief kind of selfie at the sidelines of the UN in New York. So when it finally came to this moment, there was a lot riding on it, not only because they'd taken so long to kind of set this up, but for Australia, we had so much at stake waiting on AUKUS. How could we leverage our critical minerals? What about tariffs? Where are we going to land on all these things? And also, you know, stepping into the White House with Donald Trump, we've seen how some of these press conferences have played out. So there's got to have been a level of nerves from Anthony Albanese that, you know, this went well for him and for Australia.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about, we know Donald Trump can be such a volatile world leader. We've seen, you know, I guess, if you can call it a love-in, I suppose, between himself and Keir Starmer. And then at the opposite end of the spectrum, what happened with Volodymyr Zelensky from Ukraine. Did you get any hint that Anthony Albanese felt nervous, or did he seem confident the whole way through?
I mean, I think my friend Charlie Croucher summed it up well, that it would have been probably a white knuckle ride into the White House. But, you know, the second that Anthony Albanese stepped out of that vehicle and was greeted at the West Wing by Donald Trump, he was beaming with this big smile. And if he had any nerves, you wouldn't know it, because once we stepped into that room, everything felt so warm and natural, and it was a really nice dynamic between the two leaders. We didn't really know what to expect, and a lot of this sometimes comes down to what mood is Donald Trump in on the day. Is he in a combative mood? But, you know, he was writing off the successes. He'd been in the Middle East and had been, you know, signing peace agreements, and things have been going well for Donald Trump. So he came into this with a very happy path and a happy attitude, and we saw that between the two. So I think if Anthony Albanese had any nerves, they were pretty quelled the second he stepped out of that car.
You've kind of alluded to this already, but I want to get a sense of how it works behind the scenes from the Australian media when an Australian Prime Minister makes a visit like this to the White House. How much do you get to see compared to what goes on behind closed doors, and how stage managed is the whole event from your perspective?
Oh, it's so interesting. I mean, Donald Trump is a man who's worked in television, and we know that he loves the cameras. He likes to work them. And just stepping into the cabinet room, the immediate first thing I saw was Donald Trump saying, "Where's the pool camera?" And that is the camera that goes to all of the networks, and he wants to know exactly where he's looking. And he runs this like a TV show. So definitely from, you know, the camera's perspective, it feels like you're in a bit of a production and things are switched on by Donald Trump. But you know, it is a lot of organisation that goes into these things as well. We had to have the Australian ambassador, the Australian embassy really working behind the scenes to set this all up and to bring this together. And while, you know, I'm based here in Washington, so I have access to the White House. For our Australian press corps who flew over, that's all worked by the Australian Embassy and through the Department of State. So to get into the White House itself is a whole ordeal. And then you see those little moments behind the scene, which are really interesting. Like while we were waiting for that cabinet room meeting, we were standing kind of inside the West Wing, and being in there is, there is just so much history. There are pictures that Donald Trump has hung up on the walls, many of him signing these peace deals in the Middle East. And I was standing towards the back. I was right at the windows. And as we were standing there waiting, Donald Trump and Anthony Albanese actually walked by on the other side of the doors, and we saw the US president showing Alvo the Rose Garden and all of the pictures he'd hung up. And what I could see from both of them, they were just smiling and looking happy. And we know that Donald Trump then took Albo into the Oval Office for a look as well.
Okay, we know after this meeting, during his trip to Washington, the Prime Minister afterwards did spend a fair bit of time with Ambassador Kevin Rudd. They went to a few events together. It must be said that there has been a lot of praise for Kevin Rudd's involvement in getting the deal to the point that it has got to so far. So, I mean, apart from that little embarrassment, the whole meeting seems to have gone, better than expected.
Absolutely. I mean, there couldn't have been more things really reasonably expected that we could have got. Like, we walked away with what is looking like a really strong relationship between the United States and Australia. Our two leaders are looking like they're getting along really well. And while you did have that awkward moment, it was all smoothed out. There's been no bad blood left. Donald Trump says all is forgiven. And for Australia, we are looking in that strong position. We've seen, as we spoke about, some of those disastrous press conferences between leaders, and that wasn't the case for Australia.
Okay, let's get to, I guess, the real reason for these meetings and the deals that were done. We heard a lot about critical minerals and rare earths. I think for, the average Aussie, maybe not really sure what those things are. Can you explain what critical minerals are and why Donald Trump wants Australia so badly?
Yeah, so critical minerals, right, they're basically used in every single technology: phones, solar, batteries, weapons of war, and also AI. We're seeing so much artificial intelligence now, and all of the computer hardware for that, it needs rare earth minerals. So this is something that Australia has a lot of. We have an absolute abundance of them. And up until now, the United States has really relied on China to get those rare earths. But China has now restricted its exports, and that means that prices have gone up for the United States. But Australia is sitting over here and we're a bit of a gold mine. There are 50 critical minerals and we have 31 of them. So simply put, America needs Australia here in order to counter China. And also the United States doesn't have the open mines, the volume of those like Australia does. So this deal is going to boost the supply for the United States, and in return for us Aussies, it means that there'll be a real investment from the US in processing our critical minerals. And, this is worth $13 billion, and we're going to see the first of that with both sides investing $1 billion within the next 6 months.
Yeah, mining companies here in Australia involved in that, very, very happy with this announcement. We had one on the show, on the Today Show this week, also praising Kevin Rudd for his involvement in getting that deal forward. There was also a question mark over the AUKUS alliance because the Trump administration is reviewing it, but we kind of got reassurance there too.
Yeah, there was basically a Loctite guarantee from the US president. I mean, as soon as we stepped into that room, before the president had even said a word, there was a real sign of that, because seated along that row was the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, and the Chief of the Navy, John Phelan. And that was an important signal as to how much, importance the United States puts on AUKUS. And when he was asked outright, Donald Trump said that he would guarantee the delivery of those nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. And while he didn't put an exact timeline on how long that would take, he says he wants to expedite the delivery. And I think that was, a real relief to not only Anthony Albanese, but to Australia at large, because this big Pentagon review that's been happening has really placed question marks over the AUKUS deal. And look, there must have been a little bit of confidence from Anthony Albanese coming in, because he actually brought over a little submarine model for the US president as a gift. So nice little
Do we know? I was wondering, Lauren, whether that submarine might have been gold plated, because we know Donald Trump loves all things gold and fancy. Do we know what it was made of, or is that a bit of a secret?
This is the exact same thing I wondered, Jane, and I would love to see it, because Donald Trump loves these little model things, and they always have gold around them. So I personally am picturing a gold submarine, and I really hope that's the case.
I thought it was a genius gift, because what do you get Donald Trump? You know, I mean, he could get anything he wanted, so I thought it was particularly good. They also, you know, Australia seemed to get a bit of a reassurance in terms of defence spending, because we know Donald Trump has been on this push, particularly with NATO countries, for them to up their defence spending. Australia wasn't spending as much as he had wanted, but it seems that that's no problem either.
Yeah, when he was asked about it, he really glossed over that, saying, oh, if they want to spend more, feel free. But he was certainly not concerned about it. So that was another big win for Australia. We've really walked away from this meeting well.
I mean, that we had Anthony Albanese on the show with Carl and Sarah on Wednesday morning, and I've got to say, I don't think I have seen him this happy and relaxed since the morning after the election. It feels like even he is kind of, you know, excited by how well it went.
Oh, absolutely. I really got that sense from the PM, because we'd kind of seen him at these few events before he came on the show, and he'd been kind of crisscrossing in what felt like a bit of a victory lap around Washington, D.C. And he was just so bubbly talking to Carl and Sarah. I mean, there's no doubt this has been a success, and the PM's come away with a really reinforced friendship. He is happy, and he's flying back down under, you know, with a new deal signed and a great lead, you know, back home. Things are going well.
I mean, the friendship part is interesting, isn't it? Because when you think about these two men, they really have grown up at opposite ends of the spectrum. You know, Donald Trump, son of a real estate mogul in New York City. Anthony Albanese famously grew up in public housing in Sydney with a single mother. Their upbringings could not be more different. On the Middle East, we've seen Australia side with other countries rather than the US in recognising a Palestinian state. How do you think they were able to kind of navigate those differences and you know, get on so well?
Yeah, it's so fascinating, isn't it? And one of the things I laughed about as they were kind of, you know, all warm and bubbly and talking was the pair having a bit of a chuckle about golf. I think it's just golf for the US president, isn't it? I mean, the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was joking that Donald Trump should come down under to Australia for the President's Cup. I mean, that's not until 2028, but I think Donald Trump quite liked the idea of that. And then, you know, you had the PM joking that he might use some of the praise that Donald Trump gave him in his campaign in 2028 himself. So, I mean, the relationship was warm despite that huge difference in their lives. They are just such different people, such different sides of politics. And I mean, to see that, it's a great sign for Australia. And when push comes to shove, America is, you know, one of our oldest allies. And here, the two leaders seemed like old friends.
The irony in that ad campaign comment, though, considering at the last election, Labor kind of used Donald Trump as you know, against Peter Dutton rather than, you know, as a positive. So I found that was funny. The one issue, though, that we sort of didn't seem to get any movement on, and nobody really seems that concerned about right now, is tariffs.
Absolutely, yeah. We really kind of passed over that. I think there was so much success in these talks between the two sides that it's been a bit, not today, but maybe down the track. I mean, Australia is on that 10% baseline, which, you know, when Donald Trump was asked about it, he said, well, you've got the lowest that I've put on anyone. And that is true, but we also have industries that are still up against it, like our pharmaceuticals and steel and aluminium. So there's still work to be done, and that's exactly what the US president says. He says there's more work that we can do between us. So no sign of kind of a deal on tariffs at this stage, but at least there's, you know, no imposing of further tariffs like we've seen on other countries. So no movement on the tariff front right now.
Okay. Before we wrap, Lauren, I just want to circle back. Did anyone get a chance to ask Kevin Rudd how he felt about that public dressing down in the cabinet room? Do we know how he reacted afterwards?
I would love to know, because whilst he has been out and about with Anthony Albanese, you know, dotting around for those last appearances, he hasn't been in front of the journalists, and I would love to know how Kevin Rudd felt. But you know, we know that it was smoothed over, but it must have been a bit of a weight to carry, because this went not just, you know, across the United States. I think it went a little bit global. Like, I saw coverage of this absolutely everywhere on newspapers and TV here in the US. It was really being picked up. One of my Colombian colleagues who I work with around the White House said, oh boy, you're ambassador. So how is Kevin Rudd doing? Look, I think he's not too bad, because Anthony Albanese says he's not going anywhere.
Yeah, that's true. And that was going to be my final question, Lauren, so I'll get you to expand on it a little more. We know, obviously, that this visit has made huge headlines in Australia. How much has it been picked up in the US? I mean, is it just the Kevin Rudd stuff, or are people interested in the relationship as a whole?
No, I think people, it's hard not to love Aussies, and definitely my colleagues in the White House were interested that, Australia has made it to the White House for a visit. There was a lot of talk about the critical minerals deal. I saw one of my CNN colleagues at the White House filming a piece on what that means for America and how, substantial and important this is. Also for the United States, just as it is for Australia, but certainly it was the ambassador's moment who took a lot of those, the viral moments. You could see it on TikTok and on Instagram. So I think a little bit of both. It's, a lot of coverage for Australia though.
Well, you've had a busy week, Lauren. How are you going to unwind, or does the news never stop in Washington, DC?
Jano, you know this place. Donald Trump is the newsmaker. We're always front row at the Trump show, so we rest while we can and we wait for the next headline.
Lauren Tomasi, it is always good to chat with you. Thank you for joining us on Today's Take.
Thanks, Jane.
And thank you for listening. We are going to take a short break from Today's Take next week, but we will be back with more in November. Leave us a rating or give us a follow if you've enjoyed today's chat, and have a listen to some of our previous episodes. Until we are back, I will see you bright and early with the rest of the Today's team. Have a great day.